And thanks for inviting me here. I've been in Turkey for a week. I'm getting a bit of echo there. Is that annoying? How are we getting that echo? Is it okay? He's going to fix it. Thanks very much for hosting me. And I've been to, I think, 12 institutions in the last 5 days and had a very nice welcome from the teachers and the universities I visited. And the trip's been sponsored by Cambridge University Press and Dunia, the distributors, and the universities that have been hosting me. So thank you very much. Lovely to be here. Unfortunately, I could only be here for the latter half of today. I just came in from Izmir, and then tonight I'm off back to Hong Kong. One of the things I'm interested in, as we all are, of course, is what makes a good teacher. And over the years, I've looked at this from different points of view, different perspectives. And today, I'm just going to focus in on one little aspect of the nature of good teaching, and that's the notion of creativity. And of course, creativity is something that we hear talked about everywhere these days in business, in education, in finance, and so on. So it's supposed to be the sort of driving force of innovation, and innovation is kind of the driving force of competitiveness and so on. And so schools, just as other organizations, are encouraged to develop a creative culture to help students attain the levels of learning that are expected of them. So I'm going to talk about a number of dimensions of creativity, and first of all, we'll see if we can get my clicker to work. Perhaps it has to be turned on, does it? Where's my technical man? Let's just see. Is that it? Let's just see if we can get our clicker to work.
There's only one?
That's only one there, but we have a technical man somewhere. Let's see if we can get that to work. It was working before, I think. Where is our... It's working now?
No, it's working here.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the door was closed. Great. So I want to look at what we mean by creativity, why creativity is important, and what its relevance is to language teaching. I'll make the slides available if you want to have them. First of all, let me just give you a little test of your own creativity. So supposing you have been asked to substitute for a teacher who didn't turn up. 5 minutes time, you've got to teach a spoken English class, intermediate level. Your only teaching aid is this cup of water. Give you 2 or 3 minutes to think about what would you do. How are you going to fill that 50-minute period productively, getting speaking output around that little piece of content. So let's see what ideas, what creative ideas you can come up with in 2 minutes. All right? All you have is that. Do you think, if somebody volunteers an answer, could you run the microphone out to them? I think you have to turn it on, and then we'll turn it off when we finish. Yeah. Judging by the buzz, you're having no difficulty coming up with an idea of perhaps just how to get the lesson started. So perhaps would somebody like to volunteer how they might get the lesson started? We have a microphone that we're going to hand to a colleague there. Is it on? Otherwise, I'll just summarize what someone says. No? That one's not working? Never mind. Somebody perhaps near the front, and I can then repeat what you said. Anyone like to suggest how they might start the lesson? Is it working? Great. All right, let's have a volunteer. Thank you.
I would drink the whole glass of water.
Okay.
And I would ask my students if you could fill that glass of water, instead of having it be full of water, what would you want to possess? It could be any magical powers, it could be anything in the world that you wanted to fill that glass with. And after drinking it, you would possess all of those abilities or whatever that they came up with.
Great, a little fantasy element. We're going to come back to that when we look at some of the notions of what we mean by a creative task. And fantasy is often one element. We have a colleague here who's got an idea there. Please.
We had lots of ideas. One we thought about was have students get in group and make a list of all the idioms they know that are associated with water.
Nice. Okay.
In their language or in English.
Right, little vocabulary building activity. Let's take one more and then I'll give you another teacher's comments. Please.
Hiya, I'll ask all my students to imagine that they're somewhere different and then take a sip and tell us what they're drinking, where they're drinking it, who they're drinking it with, and what kind of conversation they're having.
Interesting, so different situations. Okay. So what you're doing here, of course, is you're calling on what we sometimes call your pedagogical reasoning skills, the ability to pedagogicalize a piece of content, to see possible learning outcomes from it, to think about language and so on. Although I'm having you here focus just on the kind of creative thinking you bring to that task, let's look at what a teacher said she would do. And so she said she would start, as you see, there were little brainstorming tasks, not unlike yours. How many types of containers can you think of and what are they used for? And then they'd group them according to their functions, I guess things for water, carrying water, things for carrying food, and so on. And then suggesting the sort of language that they could use. And then she said they would present their findings, a little competitive element. They go to the board and they see who came up with the biggest list. And then, for a change of pace, she would do some dialogue work, practicing asking to borrow a container from a neighbor. First, I'd model the kind of exchange I wanted to practice. She gives them a little schema there, a little skeleton for dialogue. And then they perform their dialogues. So just a little example there of a teacher demonstrating creative thinking. And so I want to go into this notion of creative thinking in a little more detail by exploring what creativity is and how it works, drawing on some data from a number of different sources. Typically it's defined in these ways, the ability to look at things in different ways, to come up with novel solutions to things, to have imaginative thoughts and so on, and to see new meanings in and new learning possibilities in things. We can think about two sides to creativity. One is the notion of creativity as a product. In other words, what kind of brains do creative people have? What goes on in the heads of creative people that makes them a little different from others? And we all know among our friends and family members and colleagues, some people are very creative. They can look at a dreary piece of lesson material and really think of fantastic ways of using it. And they can go into their class and improvise and build wonderful lessons around things that they hadn't really anticipated until the lesson began. So one way of thinking about creativity is to look at the cognitive dimensions of creativity. What is it in the heads of creative people? The other, of course, is to look at the products. What is it that creative people produce? And so when we look at pieces of art or pieces of literature or pieces of clothing and so on, we look at the results of the creativity of the people who made them. So there are two sides to creative thinking, creativity, product and process. And I'm going to look at these dimensions here. And I was prompted to start thinking about this, first of all looking at some research from the UK. I think there's some colleagues from Christchurch, Canterbury here, is that right? I thought I saw on the program. Was it this conference or another one? Maybe not. Not this one. Anyway, somewhere in Turkey this week. And the colleagues in a school in Kent went into some primary schools which had been identified as reflecting a very creative ethos on the part of teachers and on the part of the school. And this was linked to partly the personal qualities of the teachers, who they investigated, what attributes they brought to their teaching, also to the kinds of pedagogical practices they made use of, as well as the culture of the school. What did the school do to nurture creativity among its teachers. And so prompted by that, I started some conversations with teachers in a number of countries. Last year when I was traveling in Mexico and South America, we ran a competition and in which we invited teachers who had a creative disposition, if you like, who reported to have a creative disposition, to write an essay about their philosophies of teaching and how they applied this in their practice. And those essays were first screened by some teacher educators in each country, Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and so on. And then a small group of them had the chance to meet with me. In fact, the first prize winners spent one evening with me, the second prize winners 2 evenings, and the third prize winners 3 evenings. From those conversations, I had a dialogue, and I've also been looking at 3 or 4 people that I know well, that I've worked with in different contexts. Dina Mahoney, a friend in England, Sarah Cottrell, a New Zealand colleague who teaches in the United Arab Emirates, and so on. And so I've been pursuing these conversations, and that's the data set that I'm drawing on today. And I'm going to divide the talk into 3 complementary sections. The first is the sort of attributes that creative teachers bring to their teaching, and so I'm going to give you extracts of the writings of the teachers who wrote to me and the conversations that we had, and then go a little further and look more at how they apply these attributes in their teaching, and then lastly look at the school context. What is it that schools can do to foster creativity? So I'm going to start with the attributes that creative teachers seem to possess. What makes creative people different, particularly teachers? And the first point I would like to make, or the first principle I'd like to share with you, is the notion that creative teachers are knowledgeable. In other words, creativity, if it's to be productive, is not simply the result of trying to do things differently. It has to be based on a knowledge source. It has to be supported by principles. And perhaps I can give you an example, first of all, of a teacher who was creative, but where the creativity was not based on a knowledge source and therefore served no purpose. And this was a man, an American I worked with, who had had quite a lot of experience but no formal education in ESL. He, as you know, native speakers have a special gene which enables them to teach English without any training. And he was one of those people who thought he knew a lot about teaching. And he had a technique he called sponting, in which he would start every lesson, whether what kind of lesson it was, he would spend 10 or 15 minutes, he'd write a word on the board. It might be the word English, and he'd say, what word starts with E, what words start with N, and what words end in ISH, and maybe they'd come up with, Finnish. Okay, Finnish, that's a language. Where's it spoken? And you know what a finishing school is? And so it would go on and on, 10, 15 minutes of the lesson gone, and I asked him to justify what you think this is doing. What are you trying to teach? And he really couldn't come up with a convincing answer. This is creativity not linked to any real purpose, not based on knowledge, if you like. But let's look at some examples of creativity from language teachers that is informed by a solid knowledge base. They know what they're doing, they know stuff. Here is a teacher talking about using her knowledge of text structure there in the way she improvises in a lesson. She talks about, for example, suddenly deciding to do a little jigsaw narrative activity where the students work in groups and make a story and so on, and adding to it. But she does so not because it's fun and interesting, but because she sees this a way of reinforcing something that she wants to teach about the nature of text. So that's an example of creativity linked to a knowledge base. She's driven by not simply fun, but by a pedagogical purpose. Here is another teacher talking about the way using dictogloss in a writing class, and you probably are familiar with that technique where you read a text very quickly, too fast for the students to write it down. They get together in groups and they reconstruct it. And then once she has finished, she has them from each group write their text on the board, and they compare their text with the original. So it's a way of focusing on what's the point of these connective markers and why is this text better sequenced than that one, and so on. Dictogloss, you probably know that technique. But as she says here, she does it not only because, as she says, it's a real crowd pleaser, she says, it's also pedagogically very sound. So that's the first principle, that creative teachers are knowledgeable. Secondly, the notion of confidence. It requires confidence, and partly confidence is a follow-up from being knowledgeable, because the more you know, the more willing you are to try things out, do things differently. So it gives teachers a sense of control, of autonomy, if you like, in their own classrooms. Here, Jose talks about creating a personal, turning his classroom into a personal learning space, doing different things to give the students a sense that when they come into his classroom, it's going to be something a little different is going to happen. Another teacher here, Manuel in Peru, talking about, as you can see there, now he's much more confident, willing to follow his intuitions, to try out new approaches and strategies. Confidence. So creative teachers are confident. Committed to help their learners succeed. Why does one want to be creative? Why bother, in a sense? Well, I think it's when you talk to these creative teachers, why do they make such an effort to do things differently, to not repeat themselves, to look for variety, and so on? Because they're committed to helping their learners succeed, not because they're committed to getting better grades from a supervisor, but because you'll see that they describe this sense of commitment. And this teacher, Rosalind, talks about assurance. Interestingly, this is a point I've heard from several teachers in Turkey this week who tell me that this notion of self-assurance is the first barrier that they have to break down when students come to prep from secondary school, or even secondary school. The students come in with a sense that they can't really learn English. And she said once that 2 or 3 teachers have articulated this idea to me this week, that working on that is the first barrier to overcome. And once students feel, yes, I can, you begin to see them making progress. So this focus on this commitment to helping learners succeed. In this case, the teacher talks about a personal connection with students, keeping in touch with them, if you like. He's concerned not only with what they do in his class, but how well they do once they leave his class, and what a pleasure it is for him to have a conversation with them sometime later. A commitment to helping teachers, helping their learners succeed. Of course, creative people are often nonconformists, aren't they? The way they dress, the way they think, the way they act, because conformity is the enemy of creativity, isn't it? If you ask when is something not creative, what is the opposite of creativity? It's something that's done the same way every time, isn't it? Something in which there's never any change. So that's, if you think about the converse of creativity, that's what it is. So creative people are, in a sense, nonconformists. They look for ways of making lessons unique, as Manuel talks about here. He wants the students to feel that there's something different about the way he teaches. Not that he's showing off or competing with other teachers, but personal learning space, as he talked about earlier. This teacher talks about effective surprises. He wants students to not to know what to expect, if you like, when they come to his class. Not simply a question of doing things the same way each time. And I like the example that he gives there, that he sometimes uses examples from the Ministry of Education website, and they get a real kick when they realize that the text that they've been asked to edit and correct have actually been produced by somebody in the Ministry of Education. The notion of nonconformity, but through creating effective surprises. Of course, to be creative, you not only have to know stuff about your subject matter, but you have to have access to a wide range of strategies. And so you naturally would expect experienced teachers to be more creative than novice teachers, because they have a whole bank of ideas that they can tap into quite flexibly, a lot of variety in the way they teach. And this teacher talks about having 20 different ways of dealing with a writing task, depending on what they're working on at the time. Sometimes a sort of product focus, and sometimes more of a process focus, if you like. risk-taking is also a feature of creativity. If you're going to be creative and try things differently, you've got to be prepared to fail. So you've got to, that also links to what I said earlier about confidence. If you're confident, you'll be willing to take risks and you won't be discouraged if things don't always work. And a lot of the teachers talked about how they try things and how they don't always work, but however they keep thinking about alternatives. And so here, Efron, the young man in Mexico, talks about his attempt to use a writing portfolio which didn't work, but anyway, he's just going to rethink that, try something else. He's not going to be totally discouraged by that. Here, this teacher talks about using technology, and she was a bit worried about whether this would work, having students on a tandem language learning website where they link up with other students and engage in chat and so on. And so she gave it a go and found that, in fact, some of the students were very enthusiastic about it, and that enthusiasm, in a sense, spread. So that was a good learning opportunity, even though there was risks involved. And this teacher in Cambodia talks about this willingness to take risks as a consequence of her professional development, her growth over time, and that she learned some of this really through attending workshops and conferences like this one today. And the principle there, if it doesn't work first time round, try again. Again, I talked about the fact that creativity is driven by a wish to help learners succeed. And this trait is seen in a lot of the comments of the teachers who seek to achieve learner-centered lessons. How do they do that? What techniques do they use? Here, Jose talks about having students bring examples of texts to class. So instead of just using the texts in the book, they might be looking at a particular type of text. He will ask them to collect texts from their academic subjects or from magazines or wherever, and use those as the basis for an activity, student-selected content. Here again, this teacher talks about lists of idioms and expressions they meet in or they bring to class. Use these as the basis for vocabulary building and great resources for building activities around their interests. And if you were at the previous session, you would have heard lots of ideas as to how you can use mobile phones and other technology to do these kinds of things very effortlessly. Or trying to make connections to the students' lives through what they're doing in the classroom. And here the teacher talks about writing advertisements, adapting them so they actually reflect the lives of the students rather than just the content of the textbook. Even though it's slightly artificial in a sense, they wouldn't probably do this outside of the classroom, it does make it a lot more relevant for the student. And lastly, the notion of reflectivity, which one of our colleagues was just talking about in a very interesting session on reflective approaches to teaching. And this is an attribute most of the teachers reported, that a teacher who is creative is one who's constantly looking at practice, asking questions about practice, making innovations in practice, and so on. Perhaps asking these kinds of questions here, engaging in critical reflectivity to better understand their own teaching and to look for ways in which they might improve their teaching, if you like. And how do they engage in this process of reflection? Well, different ways. One teacher here talks about keeping a teaching journal, pretty straightforward, writing things down from time to time, because as you know, in the course of a week so many things happen, a lot of it disappears, but sometimes noting down an idea to process and think about again is a good basis for review and reflection, and so he finds that useful. It's not necessarily something everybody would enjoy. This teacher talks simply about having students comment on what they thought the purpose of a lesson was, what they thought they learned from an activity. So having students scribble notes on what they think went on in the class. It's quite interesting sometimes when you compare students' perceptions of a lesson from those of the teacher. I sat in on a class recently in Hong Kong, and it was a substitute teacher, so I shouldn't be criticizing him who didn't know the material. He was teaching from, I think, the textbook. He had the teacher's manual here. He would look at the book, very closely for several minutes, then he'd do an activity. Then he'd look at the book again, and then he'd do the activity. And it was pretty awful. But anyway, I chatted up 2 or 3, they were adult students. As we left the building and walked to the subway, I sort of asked them, how did you think the lesson went? And they actually quite liked it. I was quite amazed, very uncritical. I asked them what they thought the lesson was about. One lady thought it was a grammar lesson, someone else thought it was a vocabulary lesson, the other one thought it was a listening lesson. So they all had very different, I'm not sure what the teacher thought it was about, but anyway, students often have a very different perception of lessons from us, don't they? That learning is not the mirror image of teaching. And so this is a very simple technique that I think this is Sarah again here. Yes, Sarah Cottrell talking about this strategy that she uses. So just to summarize then, the first point I want to make that has to do with the special attributes that creative teachers seem to have access to, and I think there are 7 or 8 of them here that we see reflected in different ways. Not obviously everybody has all of these attributes, but as I looked through the essays that the teachers wrote and as we talked more about them, these were some of the ideas that seem to be embedded in their observations and comments. Now, going a little further into the practical side, the side of how they apply these attributes in their teaching, what does this mean in terms of the way they teach? Well, one principle is that they don't seem to be bound by the methods that they were trained to use. They're very eclectic in the way they use their methods. They don't feel that teaching is the implementation of a method that they were trained to use. Eclecticism, I suppose you'd call it here. They choose a variety of approaches depending on the context. Here, this is a teacher from New Zealand who wrote at length. I just pulled a piece out from what he was talking about. And so he talks about developing a best practice, if you like, and he went on to talk about how he does this, but I just pulled out a few notes from his comments there, combining features of different methods, if you like. Creativity also involves using activities that have creative dimensions. That's a problem that I face when I try to write classroom materials, because you don't want to keep doing the same thing the same way every time. And when I look at materials that have been published, sometimes I see very creative writers at work. Do you know Adrian Duff's work at all? He has a book a few years ago called Language in Use. Have any of you taught from that book? A few nods there. Anyway, if you have a chance to look at that book, every page he does something differently. I mean, the exercises all have a little spark of creativity to them. I remember the activity he uses for introducing the present continuous in one of the low-level books, and we've all seen that introduced in a very boring way, haven't we? The way he does it is a whole set of doors, about 9 doors, with a little label on them, like the hairdresser and the gym, and you have to guess what's going on behind these doors, and students have to sit in groups and come up with as much information as they can about what might be going on behind these doors. So just a very simple technique, which I must say I stole and used in one of my own books. But the idea of a task that has a creative dimension. And so what gives tasks creative dimensions? Well, perhaps a number of different things here. Drawing here on the work of Dornier, who looks at different dimensions of tasks in his book on motivation, which is one of my favorite books. Challenge, it may be the content. We had, by the way, a nice example from one of our colleagues earlier that will belong on this list somewhere. Personal element, novelty, intrigue, individual choice. So risk-taking, original thought, fantasy. We had a nice example from our colleague there when I gave you that first task, and she started to describe a task that had a fantasy element. So activities which have creative dimensions. Now, here are some examples of teachers trying to give activities more of a creative dimension. And here the teacher talks about making use of a personal element. And she does this by plugging into their interest in social media and has them create a Twitter account and writing messages to each other. So using technology here. Here, Manuel, I think it is teaching business English, and instead of just doing the activities in the book, you know, he has the students imagine and invent their own company with a logo and a staff list and the products and so on. And right through the semester, all of their business writing is written from the perspective of this company which they've created for themselves. A kind of personal narrative. So an example of teachers pushing to make tasks as creative as possible. Flexibility is also another trait one observes in the teaching of creative teachers, the ability to use improvisational teaching, in other words, to build lessons around things that happen during the process of teaching itself, not departing from lesson plans, not sticking to the lesson plan. I often think that the worst lesson is a lesson that follows its lesson plan, because it suggests that the lesson plan is driving the lesson rather than the dynamics of the actual class itself. And so I hate to see teachers being evaluated according to how well their lesson followed their lesson plan. There may be an excellent reason for not doing so. And so this teacher talks, I like the where he talked about this, teachable moments. It's a nice little image there, isn't it? Looking for a teachable moment, looking for a moment that you can capitalize on during the lesson, some an unanticipated incident that allows you to build something around that. He does, of course, set a limit to that as well. And this teacher also, when I talked about him and shared this notion of teachable moments, talked about how he does likewise create diversions, if you like, around unanticipated moments that occur in the classroom, making the most of teachable moments. Flexibility and the ability to adapt and improvise, as you see examples here from teachers reporting on the ways they departed from their lesson plans or their lesson intentions, if you like, even if their lessons were not written out as plans. Flexibility here. So a lot of what teachers do when they teach is rewrite the intention based on the dynamics of the moment, and creative teachers seem to be very willing to do this. Looking for new ways of doing things. So, as I said, conformity in a sense is the enemy of creativity, doing the same thing in the same way. Now, I looked at a teacher and asked him how he used the dialogue in a textbook, and what are some of the ways in which he uses the dialogue in the textbook. Of course, many teachers will just use the teacher's notes as the guide and say, here's how you're supposed to do it. And he said he never followed the model in the teacher's book, and found that, so you have a dialogue here from the book, and we're an invitation to a soccer match, what time, invitation to meet. Okay, and so it comes down, I said, well, how do you use, what are some of the different ways in which you do that? Well, having students rewrite it about a different event, so changing it from one event to another, having students extend it, go further than the book, adding echo responses, or back channel signals, where you, oh really, I see, those kind of things. Have students change some of the details. So he had a whole repertoire of techniques he used to depart from the book. New ways of doing things, and so he never followed the book in a sense. He always rewrote the book every time he taught it. Another teacher talked about having students make decisions about how to use the book, how to use activities, what sort of grouping arrangements to work, to use, how much time to spend on tasks, and so on. So instead of just following the book and following the lesson plan, giving more autonomy to students and making decisions as to how the lesson would progress. making them decide or asking them to think about what aspects of a text they might like to look at and how long they think they will need. So often we make a lot of decisions that the students could make themselves, don't we? We take far more responsibility than we need to. Often in teaching, much more responsibility can be given to the students. They have a much better idea than me. I always make sure I write some kind of extension task from that teacher in Cambodia. Customizing lessons again, which we sort of talked about, adding things to them, personalizing activities from the book. Here, if the book has the students talk or provides models of, for example, describing a town, describing features of a town, which we saw in the first session this afternoon using mobile phones and an app there for that, she asks them to localize that, and then when they've written their descriptions, they pass them around, and the other students have to try to guess what feature, what item, what place in the city is being described. So personalizing the activity from the book, or even having the students become critics of the book, looking at the language in the book and asking themselves, is this text likely to work in your context? Is this likely to be the sort of thing you would write? And how could it be adapted? What aspects of it would work in your context, what would not? So having students question the textbook, and he says questioning the rules ends up teaching them quite a lot about the organization of texts. And making use of technology. Many of the teachers I talk to are very keen on exploring the potential of technology and adding technology as a strand to their teaching repertoire. This teacher talked about building writing tasks around digital games where the students, in this case the digital game is one called Ace Attorney, in which the players take the role of an attorney, have to develop a strong case, and so in this case she has them create their own cases as practice in argumentative writing and responding to others' writing to practice writing rebuttal. So tapping into technology as a way of motivating students here. And another example here, the teacher has the students turn a narrative into a movie script. We had a little example of this the other day in Hong Kong, where students in one of the writing classes had to make little 3-minute movies. And we had a movie festival, just like a real movie festival, with directors introducing their movie and so on, and that was kind of fun. So as a way of motivating students here. Also through technology here, motivating students through collaboration, and this former student of mine who's now teaching in Singapore, talking about having students make a 2-minute video, a public service announcement video. That might be something about some health problem in Singapore, or some issue that needs to be announced publicly, and she talks them through the software, produces a little model video that they can, so they can see how the various features of it work, shows them how to bring in various features, visual and sound effects. And then, of course, students can learn these things much more quickly than we do, and so they sort of took over the whole idea, made their video productions, and she talks about how motivating that was for the learners, because they're all in their own world, they're digital natives. So this, I give as an example of motivating students using creative collaboration, in this case, drawing on technology. So to summarize the features of their teaching, which the teachers often referred to, let's put those up again there. And lastly, what about the school? What can schools do if they believe that a culture of creativity is going to be good for the schools, going to be good for the students, going to be good for the learners? Fisher talks about the features of a creative school and describes them in these ways: a place where pupils and teachers are motivated, where teachers are given time and responsibility to be creative. They are also encouraged to collaborate with other colleagues. But of course, that's not always the case. Here, a teacher talks about how he was discouraged from being creative when he was given a textbook to use and said, great, I'll draw on this and I'll adapt it and make it more useful for my students. He said, no, you'll stick to the book. He was told in no uncertain terms that students measure their progress in terms of how far they got through the book, and so does the company that sponsors the course. So there's an example of a school discouraging creativity. And schools discourage creativity when they're characterized by, test-driven, curriculum-driven practices, too much emphasis on rote learning, when teachers are not given time to be creative, too much too heavy teaching load, when they're not encouraged to do so, or encouraged to develop an individual teaching style, and stuck with fixed routines and procedures. So what can schools do if they seek to encourage rather than discourage creativity? Well, one thing is to help teachers recognize what's creative in their own practice. We all know in our teaching context of teachers who are more creative than others. So how can these teachers be recognized and be showcased in a way? So simple little techniques like this, where teachers share creative solutions. They might have a website where they exchange ideas and resources they've developed. Nothing very difficult there. You probably have other ideas of your own. Creative partnerships that you might set up. Team teaching, peer observation, shared lesson planning. This is a strategy that's being encouraged a lot in, particularly in areas where I work. It came originally out of Japan, where teachers get together, they plan a lesson together as a group, they share ideas, and then they teach the lesson and observe each other teaching and come back and reflect on what happened. Shared lesson planning. There's a whole literature on that now. And here is a teacher talking about how they do it in his school, brainstorming different ways in which the material could be taught, trying to be as creative as possible. So again, collaboration and sharing through that sort of partnership. Of course, if you want your teachers to be creative, you need to provide them with the resources, the technology and any other sources that they may need to use. And lastly, how about rewarding teachers who are creative by acknowledging them when appropriate, giving them opportunities to mentor other teachers, or encouraging them to share their ideas with others through opportunities that can be provided for that. So the ways there in which schools can be encouraged to support creative teaching. So I've just focused on one aspect of teaching here. I've just pulled out one little facet of teaching from among the many dimensions of teaching one could talk about. But I think adding the notion of creativity to what we understand by teaching has benefits for learners, for teachers, and for schools. For learners, it can help learners develop their own capacity for original ideas and for creative thinking, which we're encouraged to do from many different quarters. It can also improve the quality of the learning experiences that teachers provide for students. For the teacher, of course, it can provide a source of ongoing professional development. Provides a sense of renewal and satisfaction. So when learners are engaged, motivated and successful, so are teachers. And for the institution, it can lead to increased levels of satisfaction for both teachers and students, as well as contribute to the effectiveness of the school. So then, to summarize and to conclude, creative learners need creative teachers, and creative teachers need to work in schools where creativity is encouraged and rewarded. Thank you.